Chapters 7 through 9, I thought had some of the most meaningful dialogue for the of the chapters I'd read so far in this book. Not that the other like parts of the book are bad, but just that I thought that this really started to have more food for thought, perhaps, or more dharma to it.
I enjoyed these chapters as well.
Yeah. Um, Pima starts to really get into the idea of what you're dealing with when you're turning to Dharma. And as she starts out this chapter with, it's like, you're not turning to Dharma to bring security or confirmation. You're not turning to it to give yourself ground to stand on, because that's not what's going to happen. And instead, you end up with what apparently the Tibetan phrase is yi tang chi. I don't know how to say that. Sorry. And that it is this sense of totally fed up, which I thought was interesting. Or exhausted is one of the interpretations of the phrase. And I don't know. I felt like she spent some time untangling some ideas and giving us an interesting presentation of them and mindfulness and this new concept to me. And that it's not an easily digested concept because, as she puts it, it expresses the renunciation that's essential for the spiritual path. And I thought that was fun. Fun, I say. I use the word fun just to mostly mean interesting. I really got to work on my vocab choices, so I apologize for that.
One thing that
Well,
really stuck with me or impressed me is how she emphasized that it's not about having hope to reach something better or to improve in any way, but rather to let go of hope altogether. And that is such a radically different approach than what the quote unquote common sense would say. Like, ich meine,
mm-hmm.
how often is it that we say, oh, as long as you have hope and all that jazz, but here she says, no, hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. So be gone
Yeah,
with
I
the hope.
really, yeah, I liked that. I was like, huh, yeah,
So that was a very striking point for me. I mean, it's again that the point that she's always been trying to drive home that no, we are not here to better ourselves. We are here to embrace whatever is going on. But yeah, that was
right.
really striking anyway.
Anyone else? No. Okay. So as the chapter goes on in chapter 7, she takes a moment to talk about theism, and at first I was like, "What?" And then when she got fully explained it, I thought it was very interesting of looking at it as this conviction that there's some hand to hold. And as I started thinking about that, I really thought about that analogy, and I think it's worth kind of ruminating over a little bit further. But it also helped me understand some of her other point. So that she says that Dharma isn't a belief, it isn't dogma, it's total appreciation for impermanence and change. And I think that I really love that being worded that way because I've tried to talk to someone before about it, and I think this is a very concise way of wording it. And I wish I'd had that verbiage at the time. Um, then she says the teachings disintegrate when we try to grasp them, and we have to experience them without hope. So once again, that hopelessness that she talks about before, where having the hope leads you to disappointment, like Ben said, because Dharma gives us nothing to hold on at all. And then she calls theism an addiction, which I'm like, ooh, getting spicy over here, Pima.
Yeah.
And so I'm always joyful in her wording and some of the points she hits. And I like that she referred to the first noble truth of the Buddha is that when we feel suffering, it doesn't mean that something is wrong. And so taking a moment to reflect on that was important to me because it's something that I struggle with. And so being discontent, feeling anxious, right? Like having this suffering doesn't mean that anything is necessarily wrong, but that I'm just not focused correctly. And that
I mean,
interesting duality of that thought. I'm sorry, what, Max?
the the use of suffering, or rather the view of suffering, not only as something that isn't wrong, but in fact something that can be quite helpful, um, is rather counterintuitive. But if you remember to keep suffering as a reminder, rather of I'm not being mindful, or I've misunderstood something, or something like that, rather than, oh no, life is bad. uh, it can be very instructive. It can actually be something for which we are grateful at a certain point on this journey, so that we are shown where we still have work to do because we are suffering.
Yeah.
But that kind of view is rare for someone to start with. It's like if you try to explain that to someone who hasn't practiced, they're going to be like, are you okay? You think suffering is useful and good? What are you doing?"
I mean, I can only speak for myself, but if I wouldn't be here if not for suffering. So on this path, so to say. So if I hadn't been miserable most of my life, then why would I concern myself with Buddhism, right? So or whatever. So yeah. So in a way that was an it's no, what's the word? It was my motivation to get started with all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Same for me. It's it's interesting how Buddhism uses the very thing it's trying to address as its own best propaganda.
Yes. Um. Oh gosh. I highlighted this one part and I thought it was such a neat little line. The real thing that we renounce is the tenacious hope that we could be saved from being who we are.
That just cuts right to the root.
And I was like, oh, that's so on point.
Part of that, though, is the misunderstanding of who we are, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We want to stop being who we think we are because we don't know who we are. But who we think we are, we're pretty sure isn't that great. So let's not do that. And we put so much effort into it, and then we find out, oh, I'm just fighting with a drawing of myself I made in my head.
With the drawing I made of myself. Not wrong. Oops. Too fast. Okay.
Something I also highlighted was you could even put abandon hope on your refrigerator door instead of the more conventional aspirations like every day in every way I'm getting better and better, which I found very interesting. Because I mean
Mm-hmm.
that the latter part is every day in every way I'm getting better and better. As far as I know, that actually has helped people or does help people to actually do feel better. But yeah, abandon hope is kind of the opposite of that. So yeah, we
I feel
again
like this
that
is a like
contrast
a
of
short-term versus long-term thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you can have a little psychological palliative on the fridge. It's like, live, laugh, love, or whatever the fuck. And it's just like, oh, yeah, that's a quaint little thing. Isn't that nice? I feel a little tiny bit better for half a second. And then you step outside and you're like, oh, right, the world exists and I'm in it. And as soon as that happens, that little saying goes right out the window.
Yeah.
But, for those who want to live very, I suppose, shallow lives, and I don't mean that in like a judgment way, just more of a depth of exploration kind of way. Like if all they need to get by is a little plaque on the wall, I guess that's good for them, but woe be unto them should they ever look an inch below the surface.
Woe be unto them.
I don't
That's
think that,
right.
I don't know that I agree with that. Because even
No?
if that person feels okay without exploring the depths of themselves and understanding the patterns of their behavior and everything, it's still going to affect other people. It's
That's
still going to
true.
have an impact on the world. And if they're not aware of what they're doing, even if they're completely ignorant and comfortable in them, in that kind of life of just ignoring it or being distracted from it, and they feel emotionally fine doing it, doesn't really mean that it's okay. I mean, it could be. Maybe they're really sweet and generous and all of that, but
Mm-hmm.
more
It's
likely
likely to
everybody
have
has
downwind.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
because
think
I
it's a
mean,
responsibility.
how lucky can they get, right? Because if they're acting in ignorance, it's certainly not intentional. It's luck that they haven't caused harm or received harm.
Or some people are naturally, I think, more inclined to be compassionate and generous and such. Like you meet some children who are like so eager to share and self-sacrifice
Oh
and all
yeah,
that. But even that, it leads to some bad consequences if it's unchecked. And yeah, but I don't know if we can say that. Maybe life is a little more complicated than that. There's
Mm-hmm.
not, like, it's maybe not acceptable to just live like that.
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Good chat.
Tangentially, I highlighted this part because I thought it was hilarious. I'm gonna read it to you.
Okay.
When we have reminders of death, we panic. It isn't just that we cut our finger. Blood begins to flow and we put on a band-aid. We add something extra, our style. Some of us just sit there stoically and bleed all over our clothes. Some of us get hysterical and we don't just get a band-aid, we call the ambulance and go to the hospital. And some of us put on designer band-aids. But whatever our style is, it's not simple, it's not bare bone. And I
Wait, what is
appreciate
this
that.
about?
So it's just generally wanting to ward off the sense of death and how these can provide proper motivations for insightfulness and compassionate life. Time is passing, right? And then she just suddenly talks about this, that as a reminder of death, it comes at us and we're like, let's put a band-aid on it. I gotta put a band-aid on it. But then for some reason we all come at it a little differently. We have different kinds of band-aids. And I'm just like, ah, yes, look at this weird analogy. It's gone too far, Pema. Pema, you're going a little too far. Like, I'm following you, but I don't know if it was necessary.
Right. Just
But
a
I
little
loved
thing,
it.
but at least it gets there, I think.
Yeah, it gets there, but I was still like, maybe too much. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because it amused me more than anything. And then I personally didn't have really much else I wanted to hit in chapter 7. Like I said, I don't feel like anything incredibly revolutionary happened to me while reading these chapters. So, but I do like the reiteration of thought, the reminders to refocus, and that death is not the scariest thing that could happen to me.
Okay, real quick. I know you said death, but my brain insisted you said death.
Yeah, death is not the scariest thing that can happen to you. Do not worry. Do not fear death.
Are you sure? Are you sure, Des? Are you
Think
sure?
about the depth of that question or that statement, though. That's like me saying Max is not the worst thing that could happen to me. But then you think about it for a second, and you're like, wait a minute, though. That's the whole ego problem, isn't it? Maybe it is the worst thing that could happen.
It is the worst thing.
A little bit of contest here.
So I
Yeah.
talk about myself so often in the third person that I'm really afraid I'm going to do it in front of my students. Like on the internet, I'm like, Des did this today. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I wonder if this is a bad habit to be in front of my students. What am I going to do? Be like, Miss West did this today. What are you guys doing?
Yes, exactly.
Oop, too far. All right, chapter 8 has a fun name of 8 worldly dharmas. Gets into some classic Buddhist teachings as she opens it up. Talks about some simple teachings, and then she talks about the opposing parts of things like pleasure and pain, loss and gain, fame and disgrace, and praise and blame. And I have to tell you, it felt very rhymey when I was reading it. I was like, ooh, what a fun rhyme. And it keeps us stuck in the pain of samsara, is this dichotomy that exists, right? So we're feeling good, then we lose that feeling good, then we want it back, all these things, right? So not going to stick on this page personally too long unless anyone has some deep thoughts they want to add. For me, I was like, oh yeah, samsara. And then I moved on with my life from that page. We additionally are hit once more with a reminder that our emotions and our fears and all of these things are not to be run away from, but they're something we should get to know. And to help with our perceptions of reality, and as we let go of our attachments and all of that, right? She has some fun analogies she puts into. She goes more into the dichotomy of those thoughts and how they pull us into samsara. And then she calls the human race predictable, which, not wrong. Not wrong, Pema. She talks about how the stories behind how Buddhism got to Tibet, which is a lovely little story. Very interesting. And then ultimately for me, I was the most intrigued by her story, analogy usage of the idea of a child building a sandcastle. So I highlighted here. We are like children building a sandcastle. We embellish it with beautiful shells, bits of driftwood, and pieces of colored glass. The castle is ours, off limits to others. We're willing to attack if others threaten to hurt it. Yet despite all our attachment, we know the tide will sweep the sandcastle away. The trick is to enjoy it fully, but without clinging. And when the time comes, let it dissolve back into the sea. And I loved that, mostly because personally, I have recently been to the ocean a few weeks ago. And so I'm like thinking about that sand, and I have a very like visceral, tactile memory of it all right now. So just enjoyed that.
Yeah, very striking imagery. I agree.
And then she continues to talk about like, you know, we get to a certain point in our practice. The practice isn't just about how we are changing as individuals, but how our motivations can change because we don't desire just to tame ourselves, but, you know, we want to see the world free of its suffering. And I thought that was interesting. We get seduced by samsara. I thought, you know, that's not wrong, right? I'm seduced right now by the idea of a chocolate cupcake. I want that in my life. And so just embracing our part in the whole human dilemma and all of those thoughts. So for me, chapter 8 had that cute little metaphor of sandcastle, but overall was just a reminder of what samsara is and how we're a part of that problem, and there are ways to navigate around it and through it and with it. Any thoughts, Ben?
I don't think so.
Good talk. Sorry to breeze through chapter 8 so fast. I just don't have a lot of thoughts on it other than what I shared. Chapter 9, 6 kinds of loneliness. Did you know you could be lonely in 6 different ways? No.
Not until today.
So I thought it was really interesting that when it comes to these harsh feelings or the desire for relief, I highlighted here, as human beings, not only do we seek resolution, but we feel that we deserve resolution. And then she says, however, not only do we not deserve resolution, we suffer from resolution. So not only do we not deserve the thing we think we deserve, it hurts us. So it just all comes around, don't it?
How very human of us.
How very human. How very predictable. She refers to this this process, right, is often a bit of a detox. And I think that's an interesting way to look at meditation, mindfulness as a detox, right? This middle way that awakens us and all this stuff, right? I'm trying to pull vocabulary from her chapter while I'm talking, and it doesn't always work out the way I hope. And so to call it a detox was really interesting to me because given everything we've ever talked about with ego and samsara and our addictions to it, it really is a bit of a detox. You gotta get it out of your system, and then you're like jonesing for it forever. But she says that a straightforward discipline prepares us to stop struggling and discover a fresh, unbiased state of being. I'm working really hard to get to that state. Haven't felt it up very often, a couple times maybe, of like, wow, this is it. I've let go. And then I feel like I'm immediately right back where I started.
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah. And then she says there are 6 ways of describing this cool loneliness. I can't remember why she calls it a cool loneliness, other than it's cold. And how it ties into boredom and anxiety, right? So the less desire we have, less desire is the willingness to be lonely without resolution. So that we're not yearning for these things or to be cheered up, right? We just kind of are what we are in that moment, as many things that I think we talk about with Dharma. So she goes through these 6 kinds of loneliness. Interesting. I have a weirdly conflicted feeling about thinking about this too much, because in my brain right now, I'm like, this isn't helpful to me. And I think that's too much of a personal spin, right? I can see how this would be helpful depending on where you're at in your practice. But right now I'm just like, this isn't super helpful to me. I don't want to have to make a bullet list about 6 different ways I could be lonely.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Buddhists and their lists again. So
Lists. And also I've just gotten through 2 weeks of training as a teacher, and I have to tell you, it is so boring. There are so many lists and acronyms involved in teaching. No idea. I do like where she said we can just be lonely with no alternatives, content to be right here with the mood and texture of what's happening. I do appreciate that, because I think that being able to sit with the feeling of boredom is really important. It's an important skill not only for myself, but often I think about as I raise my son and then what I teach my students. Do I think that navigating through these ideas is fine? Yes. I think you should absolutely be thinking about how do I avoid unnecessarily occupying myself for no reason, right? Sure, that's great. I think you should be content. I also think that you should, I don't know, be cool with things. But once again, it's just like, oh God, a list. Why a list? But she does say loneliness is nothing to be solved. So this reminds me oftentimes when we're sitting with different emotions that arise, we try to be problem solvers and say, all right, well, how do I put this into extinction, right? We don't just see the emotion for what it is, but we want to like snuff it out and destroy it. And so she's trying to take our attention and see loneliness as something not to be solved or cured, right? It's an experience of itself. And then another thing is looking at without aggression. I highlighted this. Rather than persecuting yourself or feeling that something terribly wrong is happening right there in the moment of sadness and longing, could you relax and touch the limitless space of the human heart? It was very poetic. I don't know if I thought it helped me figure anything out. I just thought it sounded neat. And that was actually the end of chapter 9.
Well, that does pose a rather challenging question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's exactly as she said. can one calm down and just sort of touch that rather than trying to run or destroy the feeling?
Right.
Yeah, it's a skill. It's something you need to practice.
For sure. Am I exhibiting the exact opposite behavior by rushing through this chapter? Probably. I'm merely trying to real life demonstrate for you guys. This is a sacrifice, really, for you. I'm doing.
These are things not to do.
Truly selfless.
I know. I'm so humble, too. Does anyone have any further thoughts they want to share? Other than me being ridiculous?
I think you're great, Des.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah, I do too.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, sure, Ben gets thanks.
I said thank you, Max. You didn't hear me. You ignored me.
I didn't hear you. All I heard was laughing.
Oh, I said thank you. Okay. Go team. That was chapters 7 through 9 of When Things Fall Apart.
It was so short.